Okay, guys, so today we're going to be starting the notes on the post-war world. Just before we get into these notes, I just want to clarify that, obviously this is going to be taking place after World War II, so we just wrapped up World War II, and, the post-war world is also referred to as the Cold War, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but, the Cold War would span approximately 50 years, so it's going to cover a lot of different events. Including things like the Korean War and Vietnam and the whole way up until the 1990s. So just to kind of clarify, the next few units that we're going to be covering are actually going to be, a part of the Cold War. But like I said, this unit and the next unit are both going to be referred to as the post-war world because it's split up into two. So this first section that we're going to take a look at, the post-war world, is going to be the foreign perspective, meaning like what was going on around the world after World War II. And then the second part of that's going to be the domestic perspective, which is going to be what was happening around the United States for the most part. It's going to specifically take a look at, the United States and what was happening here immediately following World War II. So with that being said, Truman was the president at the end of World War II, as we know, and then he would lead us into the Cold War. And these are just some of the world leaders meeting towards the end of World War II to figure out what's going to happen with the fallout of the war. So just to kind of start things off here, it says political ideologies and aims. So essentially, as we kind of discussed a little bit at the end of World War II, the Cold War, was a war that took place, or a conflict that took place between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as you can see here, it's referred to as the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republic. They call it the Soviet Union. We can call it Russia. They're all pretty much the same thing, just like here in the U.S. we call it United States, America, whatever. But essentially, after World War II was over, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two main superpowers that were competing for basically control of the world. And so you can kind of see here on this chart, the United States and the USSR, we were basically opposites in pretty much every aspect. And so, as you can see here on the left, the United States, we value democracy. We value human rights, respecting people's human rights and making sure that people are treated fairly. Our country is predominantly a Judeo-Christian nation, meaning, we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Not that everybody is a Christian. I mean, we have pretty much every religion here, but, that was basically kind of how we saw ourselves. And then after the war, you can see here in this bottom part, it says the focus of the United States after World War II is just recovery from the war and protecting and preserving democracy around the world. So not just here in the U.S., but we were trying to spread democracy to every country throughout the world. Whereas, our enemies, the Soviet Union, they were a dictatorship. That kind of started off with Stalin, and then later it would be Nikita Khrushchev. But, they didn't have a democracy. People didn't really have a say in that country. Like it says here, no personal freedom. So they really didn't value human rights in the Soviet Union. It was more about the state, meaning the country, and what was best for the country. And then, under communism, which the Soviets were communist, they have atheism, which, as most of you probably know, that means they didn't believe in a god. There was no religion. That's not to say that there weren't people in the Soviet Union that believed in God or had religion. They just, technically, they weren't allowed to do that. They kind of had to do it in secret because according to the official government rule, you weren't really allowed to practice religion. Their focus after the war was reparations, meaning getting paid for the war damages or the war costs. And then also they were really focused on creating buffer states to protect communism. So we'll take a look at that here in a second. I'll clarify what that means. All right, so occupational rule, like it says here, Germany and Japan lay in ruins. After World War II, both nations faced large tasks of rebuilding their governments, economies, and cities. So, just imagine, the death and destruction that occurred in Germany and Japan, towards the end of World War II. And like it says here, it's It's like their entire nation. I mean, keep in mind, if you think of Germany, that's Hitler and the Nazis. They were running that country. That was their government and their military. So when the Nazis were defeated, you essentially took out the entire German government. So that's going to have to be rebuilt. And the same thing kind of happened in Japan. Japan had a government that was run by the military. So again, when the Japanese military was defeated, now Japan doesn't have a military or a government. And so the United States and the other victorious allies, they're all going to try to figure out what to do with these countries and sort of like how to rebuild everything after the end of World War II. So like it says here, there was a great deal of tensions at Potsdam as a result of occupational rule. So with that being said, this is referring to the Potsdam Conference, which was in July of 1945. Now, keep in mind, this was before the end of World War II. So the end of World War II was coming, but it wasn't quite over yet. But the Allies knew that they were going to win. And as you can see here, it says Truman, Stalin, and Clement Attlee were the big three at the Potsdam Conference. Attlee had replaced Churchill at this point. So they all agreed on joint occupation of Germany. And what that means is Germany would be divided up into 4 different zones. So Germany, that was the Nazis. Like I said, they're gone now. So basically the Allies agree that they're going to, split it up and everybody's going to kind of take a piece. And I'll show you a map here in a second. But, one thing we have to remember is, throughout World War II, we were working with our allies in order to win the war. But once the war was coming to an end and it was obvious that we were going to win, I think I mentioned this before, but this is kind of when the focus sort of shifts and everybody starts to kind of focus more on what they can get out of the war. So it's not just like, hey, let's win this war and let's figure out a strategy to win the war. It's more like, okay, we're going to win the war now, so let's the United States is going to see what we can get out of this, and the Soviets are going to do the same thing. So everybody's kind of like in it for themselves at this point. So like it says here, the British, the French, and the United States would control the industrialized part of Western Germany, and the Soviets would control the urbanized eastern part of Germany. And again, I'll show you a map here in a second. And then Berlin was the capital city of Germany. So Berlin is within Germany itself, and they would also split Berlin into 4 parts. Like it says here, it would be jointly administered within the Soviet-controlled part of Germany. And that's going to have an impact on the Cold War because it's within Berlin, even though, again, it was split up into 4. Berlin was located within the Soviet side of Germany. And I'll show you a map here in a second, and that's going to lead to some conflict. So as you can see here on this map, here's the British zone on the left, the French zone, and the U.S. zone. And then, we're controlling the left part of it, and then the Soviets are going to control the right or the eastern part of Germany. So this is East Germany and this is West Germany. So Germany was split up for about 50 years. Eventually it's going to be reunified, but immediately following World War II, Germany was split into 4 parts. And then Berlin, you can see here, Berlin was the capital city of Germany. It's located within, like I said, the Soviet side of Germany. And it's also going to be split up into 4. So here I'll show you a zoomed in map. So this is actually a zoomed in map of Berlin. So it's also divided up pretty much the same as the actual country itself. So again, this is, West Berlin. So French, British, and the U.S. And then East Berlin was the Soviet sector. And so that's kind of how they thought that, they all agreed upon that. And then this is just a map that shows you that some of Germany was lost, the territory was lost to Poland after World War II. So it says here 1945, that's the end of World War II. A lot of people don't realize, maps get redrawn, I don't want to say frequently, but within the past 100 years, maps have been redrawn, time and again. So after World War I, they were redrawn, especially in Europe. World War II, same thing. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there were 14 countries created after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, people tend to think maps have been around for thousands of years and they never change, but they do. And this is just a political cartoon here showing the atomic bomb kind of looming over these peace meetings, because it's sort of in the back of everyone's minds, the atomic bomb, and everybody kind of realizes that this new weapon of mass destruction has been created, and it's having an impact on these developments as the war is coming to an end. So the occupation of Japan, like it says here, the U.S. occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952. So after we dropped the 2 bombs, the Japanese government was no longer, it didn't exist anymore. And so the United States, basically, since we were the ones that defeated Japan, we took control of Japan for a number of years until they could get up and running on their own. But like it says here, we worked to establish a democratic government, which Japan did not have until after World War II. Emperor Hirohito remained in the imperial palace, but Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur ran the country. So again, I mentioned this at the end of World War II, but we allowed the emperor to stay on the throne just as sort of a peace offering, so that we were hoping that this would sort of help alleviate some of the tension between the U.S. and Japan. So he stayed on the throne, but Douglas MacArthur, who was the famous general from World War II, he basically ran the country. He was kind of like the president of Japan until we eventually turned over control. Like it says here at the bottom, Zaibatsu were huge corporate families that dominated Japan's economy. They were done away with, so we were trying to establish a democracy there where, more similar to what the United States had, where, people were able to vote and have a say in their government and things of that nature. War crimes, like it says here, following the war, Nazi and Japanese war criminals were tried. And I mentioned this, I think, when we were watching Saving Private Ryan, and I said about, you're not allowed to shoot a medic. There are rules of war. Sometimes people don't realize that, but there's rules of war. And if you break those rules, you are susceptible to being punished. And so, after World War II, the Germans and the Japanese both were charged with war crimes. And so, again, one of the questions that remained after the war was like, what do we do with these guys? And so in Germany, they held the Nuremberg trials. So like it says here, the International Court tried Nazi war criminals. There were 4 charges that they could be charged with. And as you can see here, it says planning the war, committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiring to commit crimes. 12 Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. 7 were jailed, and thousands were acquitted. So one thing you have to remember is most of the Nazis were let go. And I think one of the big reasons for that is because it's almost like, as you can see here, 12 were sentenced to death. So we tried to get the major players or the leaders, and we charged them with the crimes. And then most of the soldiers were let go because there's too many. You know what I mean? And then I think I mentioned this before as well, but thousands of Nazis escaped. So it's not like we got all of them. We got a good number of them, but if you Google this, a lot of Nazis got away, and I think I maybe mentioned this before, but most of them escaped on submarines, and a lot escaped to Argentina, places like that. So, but regardless, this guy Adolf Eichmann, he was the architect of the Jewish extermination program. He sought refuge in Latin America along with many others. So, like I said, Argentina for the most part, because there was a lot of German or Nazi-friendly support in that part of the world. And that is because after World War I, there were sort of like settlements established in South America by Germans. And so they were already there. And then after World War II, some of the Nazis that were trying to escape basically knew that if they got to, certain parts of South America, they would be safe and they would be helped. So that's kind of why they went there. But, this is Eichmann, and eventually they did catch him. So, there were people that were out looking for these Nazis, and, they did find some of them. And again, I think I mentioned this before as well, but every once in a while you'll hear about a Nazi that gets found. In the news, it'll be like, not too long ago they found a Nazi that was living in Florida. Obviously by this time they're in their 90s. Most of them are probably dead just of old age. So, but these are the Nuremberg trials, and you can see they're actually wearing headphones because, they didn't all speak the same language. These guys are speaking German. Some could speak a little English, but these are UN officers or soldiers here. So the UN was established, and for the most part, they were the ones overseeing these trials. So again, a lot of Nazi leaders here. Like it says here, 3 of the 19 guards tried and convicted by a general military court at Dachau for atrocities committed. So they were executed. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. He's the one that some of you may know or have heard about him, but he was the one conducting the experiments on prisoners, Jewish prisoners, just crazy stuff. I mean, if you look into this at all, he would do things like boil somebody in water to see at what temperature they would die, or freeze somebody to death to see at which temperature they would die, or they would do a lot of stuff with twins where, they would separate the twins and torture one and see if the other one could feel it. So just kind of crazy stuff like that. He was the one behind all of that. So again, trials in Tokyo. So the same type of thing happened in Japan. There was an international military tribunal for the Far East in 1946. It conducted trials against suspected war criminals. 20 leaders of the Japanese military were put on trial. Hideki Tojo was the Japanese leader. He's the one that pretty much ran the war for Japan, even though they did have the emperor. The emperor was more of a figurehead. He just was kind of, represented the royalty in Japan. But this guy, Tojo, he's the one that ran the war. He was sentenced to death. And you can see in this picture, you're probably wondering what's going on there. But he actually tried to commit suicide because, keep in mind, the Japanese believed in death before dishonor. So therefore, he tried to take his own life because that was more honorable than allowing your enemy to take your life. And you can see doctors working on him here trying to save his life. And they would. They actually did save his life. But then the U.S. sentenced him to death, and he was killed by hanging. So we saved his life so that we could execute him. So, yeah, I don't know. Anyways, the United Nations. So the founding of the United Nations, so delegates from the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union and China met in 1944 in Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C., in order to create a post-war international organization. So again, after World War I, the League of Nations was created, and the League of Nations was a similar idea. It was an organization that was created to try and prevent future wars, but it didn't really work out. So this was sort of like another attempt at that same thing called the United Nations. So it's just a group of, a coalition of countries that was created in order to prevent future conflicts and sort of deal with international conflicts so that, they could try and resolve things peacefully. The Charter of the UN, April 1945, 50 nations met in San Francisco to draw up the Charter of the United Nations. A charter is basically just a document that, it's rules, basically. With this charter, they created a General Assembly, which was all member nations of the UN, and they also created the Security Council. So the UN Security Council, like you see here, it says 15 members belong to the Security Council. They're the ones that were kind of running the UN. There were 5 permanent members included in that Security Council. So the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China were the 5 permanent members, and then you had the other members were 10 rotating members. So they would rotate periodically. But again, I mean, if you follow the news at all, you'll hear the UN Security Council being mentioned when it comes to various conflicts throughout the world where they're trying to resolve things in a peaceful manner. This is just a picture of the Charter of the United Nations. You can see here it says Preamble, we the peoples of the United Nations. I mean, obviously, the U.S. had a large hand in writing the Charter for the UN. The headquarters, October 24th, 1945, the UN's official headquarters was built in New York City. Trygve Lie of Norway was the first Secretary General, so that's basically like the president of the UN. And a lot of you have probably seen the UN headquarters, whether you knew it or not, in New York City. It's on the Hudson River, and if you go up on the Empire State Building, you can actually, here's the Empire State Building. You can see it pretty. If you know what you're looking for, you can see it pretty easily. But outside on the street, they have a bunch of flags. So again, if most of you have probably been in New York City, there's a place where there's all these international flags on display. That's outside of the UN headquarters. This land was donated by the Rockefellers. So again, Rockefeller Center, Rockefeller Square in New York City. So the Rockefellers donated the land for the United Nations headquarters to be built. Eleanor Roosevelt and the UN. So, like it says here, the United States' first United Nations delegate, one of the first delegates for the U.S. was Eleanor Roosevelt, which was the widow of FDR. And, she worked for human rights until her death in 1962. So she played a large role in establishing the UN and, just traveling the world, promoting human rights and democracy. And so, again, she was a pretty influential figure until the time of her death. So the founding of Israel. So this occurred after World War II. Palestine was a small eastern Mediterranean region that was claimed by both Jews and Arabs. So, like it says here, despite Arab protests, many Jews after World War II left Europe and moved to Palestine. The United Nations, after early conflict, divided Palestine into two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, but the Arabs objected. So essentially, if you look at a map, Palestine is a region. It's not a country. It's just a region located, as you can see here, in the Middle East. It's the location of modern-day Israel. This is all, again, I'm not going to get into this too much because it's really complicated and it's a really long history. But, if you look into all this stuff, this is all biblically founded and religiously founded, but Palestine was that region in the Middle East. But, after World War II, obviously we know about the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews and things like that. So what essentially happened was a lot of Jews moved into Europe and other parts of the world. But after the Holocaust, Jews were looking for a homeland. And, a lot of them claimed that God, basically gave them this land, this territory that we know today as Palestine. And so after World War II, a lot of Jews said, we're going to go back to the land that is rightfully ours. And so they traveled back to Palestine in the Middle East. But the problem was there were people living there. And, the people living there, which were considered, basically they're considered to be Palestinians and or Arabs. They said, we already have this land. This is our land. You can't just come in here and take it. And that's where you see this Israeli-Palestinian conflict occurring. And, again, if any of you watch the news, this has been a headline for the last couple weeks, couple months. But this has been going on for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia. So, again, it's a long, complicated history, but, it's still going on. And essentially what they're fighting over is the land. Christians, Jews, and, Muslims all kind of claim rightful ownership to these holy sites, So this is where Jesus lived, and this is where Abraham lived, and this is where Muhammad lived. And so all of these really important religious figures from all these different Abrahamic religions, they all basically we're from the same part of the world, and so therefore all these different groups are claiming rightful ownership to the same land. And so as you can see here, it says Zionism was a movement seeking a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And the guy you see in this picture, David Ben-Gurion, he was sort of like the leader of the Zionist movement. And in 1948, British forces left Palestine and proclaimed Israel as a nation. And then the United States recognized the country or the state as well, and the rest of the world would follow. So in order to be an official country, you must be recognized by other countries, and that's what that means. So the British, after World War I, the British claimed control of Palestine. So again, this gets complicated, and I don't want to overcomplicate it. I'm trying to keep it kind of simple here, but the Ottoman Empire held a vast territory in the Middle East, and after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. The British tried to claim a lot of land, and a big portion of the land was claimed by the British. After World War II, the British turned over that land, and like it says, they proclaimed it, a Jewish homeland known as Israel. And again, Israel, if you're familiar with the Bible at all, or the Old Testament, the Torah, Israel is mentioned, the Israelites, but the nation of Israel itself was not an actual country until 1948. And so once that nation was established, like it says here, the United States agreed that, okay, we're going to recognize Israel as a nation, and then the rest of the world will follow, and that's how Israel got there today. But as we saw in the previous slide, the Palestinians or the Arabs rejected that offer. So the Jews accepted the offer of Israel as a nation. There were borders drawn, and then the Arabs rejected the offer. So they never had a country created specifically for them. And so that's kind of because, again, they said that they didn't agree with that decision. So that's why there's still that conflict there today. But Israel is not a big country. The U.S. provides more financial military aid to Israel than any other country in the world. And, without getting into it again, it's pretty complicated. Israel does have a lot of influence over the U.S., just, politically. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But I'm just saying, like, we do give them a lot of money and support. But like I said, Israel's not a big country. I think, I'm certain that New Jersey's bigger. And New Jersey has a bigger population as well. And so once Israel was established as a country, there's been conflict in that part of the world ever since. So like it says here, the Arabs rejected recognition of Israel and raised military forces to try and reclaim Palestine. In 1949, Ralph Bunche persuaded both sides to accept an armistice or a peace treaty. And as a result, he became the first African-American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So, essentially there's a continuing cycle in the Middle East, and that is, there will be conflict, there will be a peace agreement, there will be a temporary peace, and then it kind of just flares up again, and then there's more conflict. So it just keeps going back and forth, and that's been going on for a long time, like I said. And so you can see here, this is Israel, but here's Egypt, Syria. So Israel is surrounded by Arab nations, Saudi Arabia, and, the West Bank. There's a lot of conflict going on here. And again, borders have changed, territorial holdings have changed. You can see here Palestinian loss of land from 1946 to 2000. So, the green is Palestinian land, the white is Jewish land, and you just kind of see here Israel has taken more and more control of that region. So, again, it's really complicated. It's still going on, and I don't know. Hopefully they can figure it out. So the Cold War begins. I'm not going to read this quote, but we're just going to get into what exactly the Cold War was all about. So with all of Western Europe in shambles and Japan in ruins, the United States and the Soviet Union were left to compete for world domination. So like we said, this is what the Cold War was all about. It was a competition or a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And like it says here, competition for global power between these two countries was known as the Cold War. But unlike most other wars, it's waged mostly on political and economic fronts, meaning there was never a direct war between us and the Soviet Union. We never fought on a battlefield. Rather, we fought the Soviets through various competitions and, just an example is like the space race. So the space race, we'll talk about it, but that was us versus the Soviet Union. Who's going to get into space first? Who's going to land on the moon first? Who's going to, similar situation was like the Olympics, right? It was always like us versus the Soviets. And, I kind of grew up, I came up during the Cold War, like I said, the Cold War would go into the 90s. But as a kid, it was always like the U.S. versus the Soviets. And that was in movies and TV shows and everything. It was always like the Soviets were like the bad guys. And if you've ever watched like Rambo, any of the Rambo movies, Rambo was always fighting with the Soviets. And then even like Rocky IV, he fights a Russian. And, like I said, this was just kind of like, this just went on for about 50 years. It was just always us versus the Soviets. Who had the better system, right? Who had the better country? Who had the better ideas? Who had the better form of government? And so satellite nations, like it says here, Baltic islands of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and most of Manchuria were sort of scooped up here by the Soviets. And you can see this political cartoon showing Stalin sort of gathering up these countries that were from Eastern Germany the whole way to the Soviet Union. And like it says here, these nations served as a buffer or protection zone, and pro-Soviet governments were established. So essentially this part of the world was taken control of by the Soviets, and then they would establish Soviet-style governments, so, communist governments for the most part. And then everything from that point to the West was, considered the Western world, and they would have democratic governments, and those were supported by the U.S. for the most part. So containment, this term or this phrase, containment, is very important because this established how the United States was going to handle the Cold War. And the term was coined by George Kennan, and he was the Secretary of State at the time. And basically, it was a policy of restricting Soviet expansion of communism. So essentially what that means is the United States is going to do everything in its power to contain the spread of communism. And the reason that's such an important term is because it's going to drive U.S. foreign policy for the next, 50 years, like I said, until the Cold War is over. And you might be saying to yourself, well, what does that mean? We're going to try and contain Soviet expansion of communism. That means we're going to do everything in our power, even if it means going to war, to try and stop the spread of communism. Obviously, you guys know what contain means. It just means we're going to contain communism just to the Soviet part of the world. And this is going to get us into a lot of conflicts. And, obviously we're going to talk about some of these, but, the Korean War was all about containment. Vietnam was all about containment. It's all about trying to stop the spread of communism, and that's going to drive what we do. That's going to drive the actions of the United States, like I said, for the next 50 years. So the Iron Curtain speech, Winston Churchill, he's still around, even though he wasn't the prime minister anymore. But he was known for always giving famous speeches, and like it says here, he delivered a speech called the Iron Curtain speech concerning the expansion of communism across Eastern Europe. And so, again, it was basically a warning to the world. He's saying, there's an Iron Curtain that has descended upon the world. And basically he's saying, like, if we don't contain the Soviets, then we're all going to be in trouble. And obviously people respected Churchill. He was also warning people about Hitler before World War II. But you can see here, this map just kind of shows you the division between, the Soviet communist side of the world and the other westernized part of the world. And again, you can see here this green line. It's just showing you here's East Germany and West Germany, and then the rest of the world kind of falls on either side. And so the nuclear arms race, obviously another big part of the Cold War. The Baruch Plan was Baruch was a U.S. presidential advisor, and he headed the creation of a special international agency with authority to inspect atomic energy plants in order to make sure that they were safe. So in 1949, the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb, and the nuclear arms race began. So, we developed ours before the end of World War II. The Soviets developed theirs in 1949, and the way the Soviets got the technology and the information to make the atomic bomb was through U.S. spies. So, they may have never been able to develop that technology without, the use of spies from the United States. And I'd have to Google it, but I can't remember the spy's name. But he basically said, it was a scientist, obviously, but he said the reason he gave the Soviets the information in order to create the atomic bomb was because it would create a balance in the world. He said it wasn't really, he didn't think it was good that one country possessed so much power. And so he thought it would be best if both sides had it. And that would sort of lead to this idea of, MAD. Like you see here, it says nuclear weapons will result in MAD. And MAD is an acronym that stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. And what that means is if one country uses a nuke, then the other country is going to retaliate by using their own nuke. And what's going to happen is we're both just going to destroy each other. And so this idea is that by both countries, the Soviets and the U.S., having nuclear weapons, it will keep both sides from using nuclear weapons because, we'll be afraid that we would just destroy each other. So it's going to deter people from using them. So that's kind of what that's all about. That's what that idea was all about, was, creating more of a balance in the world so that nobody uses a weapon of mass destruction again. Because so far the United States is the only country to ever use one. And that was when we dropped 2 of them on Japan. And so, there were a series of tests. I mean, this nuclear arms race would go on for years. Both sides would continue to try and develop more and more powerful weapons, which was pretty scary. But the United States, initially, we were doing testing out in the desert. But even that, proved to be a little too dangerous. So then they went out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and this is where they started testing their bombs. And this was called Bikini Atoll. And you can see an atoll is just a series of islands. And so they went out into the Pacific Ocean, and that's where they started testing these bombs because they thought, we're just going to disintegrate islands out there and it's not going to hurt anybody. But unfortunately, it did hurt some people because some people still lived on those small islands. But you can see here, this is the hydrogen bomb being detonated. So, hydrogen bomb was even more powerful than the atomic bomb. And, I don't know if you guys ever heard this, but that's where the name for the Bikini came from. Bikini was named after Bikini Atoll, which was where the hydrogen bomb was developed. I don't know why they would name, something fashionable about it, but I just, basically put that picture in there because that's kind of what happens in Terminator. But regardless, those of you who are fans of SpongeBob, you probably never thought about it or realized it, but, SpongeBob lives at Bikini Bottom, and my theory, I came up with this on my own, but I believe that that's sort of what that's all about, is when the bombs were detonated, the radiation created some sort of mutation that would lead to SpongeBob. So the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 was a congressional act that created the Atomic Energy Commission, which was in charge of overseeing nuclear weapons research and to promote peacetime uses of atomic energy. And again, I don't know if you guys know this, but you can use atomic energy for like power, like electricity. And so that's why they have nuclear power plants. So, once that technology was developed, there was just a lot of potential, not just for weapons, but, again, just to power cities and things like that, nuclear submarines. So in 1953, as part of Operation Upshot Knothole, the U.S. Army exploded an artillery filled with uranium. So essentially what you're seeing here is an artillery shell that is a nuke. And so they did have that technology as well, which is very dangerous because that means you can just go onto a battlefield. Instead of dropping a nuke out of a plane like we did in World War II, you could just start shooting them out of cannons. So the Soviet threat in the Dardanelles, which was a narrow strait linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, would give communists control of that region. This is when the Truman Doctrine was established. So again, the Truman Doctrine continued to just build off of that ideology of containment, and the Truman Doctrine basically said, President Truman said, as long as I'm the president, I will do whatever I need to do as long as it's in my power to contain the spread of communism. So it's just an extension of that whole idea of containment. So again, Truman Doctrine. So in Europe, European countries' economies were in shambles after World War II. So these economic problems would make Western European countries vulnerable to communist influence. So the United States was trying to figure out a way to keep these European countries from falling to communism. And so one of the ways that we would try and prevent that from happening was by the creation of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was created to aid the Western countries of Europe so they didn't fall to communism. And you can see here, essentially, you have Europe on the bike in this political cartoon. Here's the American taxpayer. So we're the ones paying for this plan. But, we're trying to keep Europe going by giving them money. You know what I mean? And like you see here, it says he's finally getting the hang of it. So the hope was that once we could kind of keep Europe moving forward, they could eventually get back on their feet to the point where they would not be susceptible to falling to communism. So we're just, again, it's all about trying to stop the spread of communism. And you can see here on this chart, this shows you which countries received the most aid from the United States. But you can see England got a lot from us. France got a lot. And, all of Western Europe was getting money from us, basically. Okay, and so essentially this shared ownership of Germany and the capital city of Germany, which was Berlin, it would cause a lot of conflict between the United States and our, Soviet adversaries. So like it says here, the non-Soviet zones of Germany grew stronger as a result of the Marshall Plan. So our plan was working. Obviously, the Soviets don't like that. So like it says here, the Soviets constructed a wall in order to keep the Western world out of their sector. So, like I said, things seem to be going well for us, and the plans that we were implementing and trying to help strengthen West Berlin and West Germany. And so the Soviets are trying to kind of counter what we were doing. And so they built this wall in order to kind of keep us from interfering with what was going on in their sector. And this would become known as the Berlin Wall. I know a lot of you guys have probably heard about this. And the wall went through a series of stages. It started off as just sort of like a barbed wire fence, and then it continually over the years was more and more heavily fortified. Eventually they start to put up watchtowers and spotlights, and it just like I said, it just continued to get more and more secure. And this was the sign that they put up, as you were crossing over across the line or across the wall. It says you're leaving the American sector, going into the Soviet sector. They put that in German and Russian as well. And so, as a result of this, the United States conducted the Berlin Airlift. So, June 1948, France, Great Britain, and the United States combined their zones and formed a Western German government. So, essentially, we combined our sides or sections of Berlin and Germany with our allies. So, France, the United States, and Great Britain all combined their sectors to form one West Berlin and one West Germany. And then on the other side was the Soviets. So the Soviet Union responded by blocking all ways linking Berlin to West Germany. So they're basically keeping us out of our part of Berlin, the capital city, because keep in mind, Berlin was located in East Germany, which was the Soviet-controlled part of the country. And so the Western Allies then conducted a massive air campaign shipping goods into the western sector of Berlin. So, again, we combined our half of Berlin with our allies. So it's basically, the U.S. and its allies half versus the Soviet half. And then the Soviets, since Berlin was located within East Germany, they're trying to keep us out of Berlin. And, again, as a result, they were blocking us. So then we started flying supplies into our half of Berlin. And that's known as the Berlin Airlift. So you can see here, the U.S. and our allies. On this map, you can see we're flying into Berlin, which was in the Soviet half of Germany. And then, just around the clock, we were flying supplies into West Berlin. Oops, I went backwards. This is just a picture of the planes coming in. So, various supplies were brought in. And obviously the people were looking forward to this because these were supplies that they needed. A little political cartoon here. He says the last two I got for the Berlin Airlift. So maybe these were Air Force war medals, and then the last two are coal and flour, because those were some of the supplies that were being flown in with the airlift. So the Western Alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created to, basically help economic recovery and military strength for our allies. So NATO, as it's become known, NATO is an acronym, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You still hear about NATO today because it's still around and it's still active. So NATO included the United States, Canada, Iceland, and 9 Western European countries who pledged to defend each other against outside attack. So this is sort of like an alliance that was created, again, in order to fight communism. So all these countries agreed that they would resist communism, and if one of them was, under attack by a communist nation like the Soviet Union, the other countries would help them out. So General Dwight D. Eisenhower, we talked about him a lot during World War II, he became the supreme commander of NATO before he became president. And so again, you see here, a lot of these Western European countries were all part of NATO. So the Cold War turns hot. So communist victory in China. In the mid-1920s, there was a civil war between nationalists and communists taking place in China. So China had a civil war in the 1920s. Now, we did talk about this. If you think back to World War II and we talked about the rape of Nanking, that was sort of part of this whole civil war situation was taking place in China. So China basically was fighting itself. That's what a civil war is when a nation is sort of fighting amongst itself, as we know from our own civil war. So the Chinese were fighting themselves, but they also had to fight the Japanese. So there was like a 3-way war going on in China, basically before and even during World War II. So as you can see here, it says Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the nationalists, and then Mao Zedong was the leader of the communists. And you can see here it says reform for peasants. So basically he was telling the peasants of China, if you guys follow me and sort of take on my communist plan, you guys are going to be better off. Communism can be very appealing to people of the lower classes like peasants, because under communism, everyone is supposed to be equal. There's no classes like upper, lower, middle class. There's no classes. It's a classless society. So a lot of times the peasants will sort of buy into that And that's what was going on in China. So the United States intervention, the United States supported the nationalists because, again, we're anti-communist. So we supported the nationalists to fight against the communists in China. We sent economic and military aid, but like it says here, Mao's forces gained control of most of the country and forced Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. So basically, he got control of most of the country except Taiwan. But the United States refused recognition of communist China, so we wouldn't acknowledge the communist government in China for a while. Eventually we would. So, but initially, because we were anti-communist, we didn't want to acknowledge that the communists were running China. We acknowledged the nationalists. And so the Korean War begins. So during World War II, Japan controlled Korea, but the Allies drove them out. So keep in mind, I mean, I just mentioned Japan was trying to take over China. So Japan was trying to control that entire region in the Pacific. And so in Korea, the Japanese had gained control of that country, but after the war was over, obviously the Japanese had been defeated, and so we have a similar situation as we had in Germany, which was, what do we do with this country that has no government anymore? And so the Allies split Korea into two zones. The Soviets controlled the northern zone, and the Allies controlled the southern zone. And if you know anything about Korea today, you know that even still today there's a North and South Korea, and so that's why. So as you can see on this map, you have North Korea and South Korea, like it says here. So the divided Korea. So the Allies agreed, okay, Soviets are going to control the North. The other allies are going to take control of the South. And like it says here, communist North Korea would be ruled by Kim Il-sung. So he was appointed by the Soviets as basically the president of North Korea. It was known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. South Korea would become known as the Republic of Korea. Pretty confusing, but that's what they were called officially. So the United States urged that the United Nations should send economic and military aid to South Korea after the North Korea invaded the nation in 1949. So we have this divided Korea, but again, the North, the communists in the North, they invaded the South because they were trying to turn the entire country into communist. So here's Kim Il-sung. In Korea, unlike here in the United States where our last name is our family name. So, my last name's English, and that's my dad's name, my grandfather's, it's like English. In Korea, it's the first name. So you see Kim Il-sung here. So Kim is the family name. And then his son was Kim Jong-il. And then eventually he would pass away. There's actually a pretty funny movie called Team America World Police. It's made by the creators of South Park. It's pretty funny. I think it's out there if you ever want to check it out. So this guy is the grandson of Kim Il-sung. And his name's Kim Jong-un. And again, if you follow the news at all today, you've probably heard of him. He's still active. And so they have all these murals and statues of their leaders in Korea. And the Korean people, the North Korean people, I should say, are taught that these leaders were descended from God. So similar to when we talked about the Japanese emperor, and I said that, they believed that he was like God on earth. That's kind of how the North Koreans see their leaders. So they basically worship these, the Kim family. And so you see these big murals around the country, statues, like I said. And these are just pictures of the recent funeral of Kim Jong-il. So Kim Il-sung was the first leader of North Korea. He passed away. His son, Kim Il-sung was the leader initially. Kim Jong-il was his son. Kim Jong-il died a few years ago, and now it's Kim Jong-un. But these are pictures of when Kim Jong-il died. And so, I don't know if these are they're real, but I don't know if the people really were this distraught over his death or if they're acting because, the people of North Korea are ruled by fear. The government is very oppressive because it was a Soviet-style government, a very oppressive that didn't value human rights. And so, these people are told, when your leader dies, this is the worst thing ever. And you got to keep in mind, sometimes people look at stuff like this and they think, how could these people buy into these, lies? But you have to remember, the people only know what they're told. The internet is censored. They don't really have outside access to media or information, so they only know what they're told. So, it's pretty crazy there, and we may be taking a closer look at that. I might show you guys a documentary on North Korea here in the near future. So regardless, bitter fighting. So the United States sent Douglas MacArthur to lead the U.S. Army of the East. So again, Douglas MacArthur, we talked about him in World War II because he was he basically was the overall military leader of the war in the Pacific. So here it says the North Koreans by September of 1950 had overrun nearly all of South Korea. So they had almost taken control of the entire peninsula. So U.S. forces on September 15, 1950 launched at Incheon and retook Seoul, South Korea's capital, and another UN army invaded from the south and captured thousands of North Koreans. The forces had pushed the Koreans almost as far as the Yalu River on the border of China. So essentially you have the North Koreans had almost overtaken the entire country of Korea. The United States and its UN allies, United Nations allies, we went in and basically pushed the communists back to the north. Now this is the Korean conflict or the Korean War. My grandfather fought in this war, so it's, it wasn't long after World War II. So shortly after World War II here, you can see 1950. So World War II ended in 1945. This is shortly after. So the tide turns again. China then gets involved and enters the war late in November and sends 300,000 troops in to aid North Korea. So again, they're communist allies. So outnumbered, MacArthur's troops then retreat back to the 38th parallel. So you can see here, here's North Korea, South Korea, 38th parallel. That's how we measure distances, I guess, or locations on a map, right? 38th parallel right here. And so that basically divided North and South Korea. And you can see China's right here, so on the border. So ending the Korean War, MacArthur ordered a major offensive without the approval of President Truman. So he kind of went over the head of the president and just started sort of making these big decisions without consulting the president, and that didn't go over well. So like it says here, conflict between MacArthur and Truman. President Truman did not support this plan. MacArthur publicly criticized President Truman and issued an ultimatum of unconditional surrender to North Korea. So again, he's kind of going over the head of his boss, and he's demanding this unconditional surrender from North Korea. And so as a result of that, Truman fires MacArthur for his actions, and a lot of people were angry at the president for that because, MacArthur was a war hero, and I would say most people respected MacArthur more than the president. And so when the president did that, there was a lot of criticism that, from a lot of people. So like it says here in 1951, the war was at a stalemate. A stalemate means nobody's going anywhere. It's stuck. And this became an issue, obviously, in the presidential election of 1952. What are we going to do about Korea? So as this presidential election is coming up, that's one of the main topics of debate. So this was the letter from the president firing MacArthur. A little political cartoon here about that. So the election of 1952, after serving almost 2 full terms as president, Truman decides not to run for the Democratic nomination. He could have run again because his first term was the result of the death of FDR. If you guys remember that from World War II, FDR died and then Truman became president, so he still could have run in 1952, but he chooses not to. The Republicans nominate war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Richard Nixon was his running mate, and you guys might recognize that name, Richard Nixon, President Nixon. He's going to come back later on, but for right now, he's the vice president. So Eisenhower was a national hero after World War II. Everybody knew who he was. He was pretty famous. And so when he runs for president, like it says here, Eisenhower wins 442 electoral votes to the Democrats' 89. So it was a landslide. And you can see here's the map of the outcome. The blue is Eisenhower. So, the red is basically the Democrats down here in the South. They won some of those southern states, but for the most part, it was an Eisenhower landslide. So the war ends July 27, 1953. Korea is then divided into 2 nations at the 38th parallel. So that's where we said there was a stalemate. So to this day, Korea is still divided at the 38th parallel. That's why there's a North and South Korea. One of the largest U.S. military bases in the world is actually in South Korea. I had some friends who were stationed there, and they said it's a highly tense environment. Both sides, there's a fence there. Both sides have stations set up, and there's a military presence on both ends. And some of my buddies there were saying that people don't realize we're on the verge of war every day with North Korea. So there's obviously there's people that try to escape from the North to the South because the South is democratic. The South is very just similar to the U.S. and how they run things, human rights, democracy, those types of things. The North is communist. So they have a dictator, Kim Jong-un, and the people don't have a lot of rights, and they just don't have a lot of privileges. So a lot of people try to escape to South Korea, or they try to escape to China. But, people have died in the process of trying to escape. So it's very dangerous. This is actually the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. If anybody's been down to Washington, D.C., you may have seen this, but these are life-size statues. Actually, they might even be bigger than life-size, because I remember seeing them, and they're pretty tall. So that's an aerial view. So here's all the statues in here. This is North Korean propaganda, and so they kind of preach a message of hatred towards the United States. They tell their people that the United States is trying to overrun them still, and we're trying to overtake them still, and to this day they have to keep fighting us. And so that's what the people of North Korea believe. And then you see this kind of propaganda a lot, where here's somebody tearing the American flag in half. These are U.S. soldiers getting run over by a North Korean tank. Here's a U.S. soldier being stabbed by a bayonet. So, again, North Korean missiles hitting the Capitol building, U.S. soldiers shooting a child, pulling a woman's teeth out, those types of things. Obviously, this is all pretty ridiculous, but again, this is propaganda. They're trying to, create a hatred towards the U.S. and the people of North Korea. They don't know any better. They don't know that this is false, and that they're being manipulated, but that's what propaganda does. So, fighting communism abroad, brinksmanship. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, I should say, under President Eisenhower, came up with a plan to use massive retaliation, meaning nuclear weapons, to stop the expansion of communism in the satellite nations of the Soviet Union. So this guy's saying we should point our nukes right at the Soviets and say, we're going to use these if you keep pushing it. Eisenhower establishes the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and its purpose was to gather strategic information abroad. So the CIA, would play a large role in international affairs, post-World War II, and they're still active today. So there's the CIA. It just shows you a diagram of sort of the structure of the CIA. So covert war in the CIA. Eisenhower tested his diplomacy in Iran by secretly removing the Iranian premier or president, Mohammad Mossadegh. He was replaced by a pro-American Shah or president, which led to hatred to Americans for interference in their government. He also sponsored a secret mission to Guatemala. So essentially what this means is the United States using the CIA, secret, sort of like tactics and things like that. And we were going into countries and removing their leaders, and then implementing or putting in our, the people we wanted in office. So in Iran, we took out their president, we put the guy we wanted in there, and then same thing happened in Guatemala. So the U.S. was doing this kind of stuff, and obviously countries, they don't really like that. Imagine somebody came into our country and replaced our president and put the person they wanted in there. It doesn't sit well with people. So, this created a lot of anti-American, anti-U.S. sentiment in some of these other countries. And even with Iran still today, there's still tension there because of things like this that have been going on. So MKUltra, the CIA conducted mind control experiments. And again, I won't go into this too much, but this isn't conspiracy theories. This is all declassified information. And, essentially the CIA had, during World War II, we talked about Operation Paperclip, where we brought Nazi scientists over to the United States to help us develop our space program. Well, some of those Nazi scientists also helped us conduct mind control experiments. And, I think we talked about this in World War II, but during World War II, the Nazis were experimenting on humans and just doing all sorts of crazy types of experiments to figure out how to control people's minds and figure out, what temperature people would, be boiled to death and frozen to death and things of that nature. So, these scientists came to the U.S. and were absorbed into the CIA, and then they were conducting and kind of continuing these same types of experiments here in the U.S. And some of these experiments were done on U.S. citizens. Most times, I should say, unknowingly. They were experimenting on prisoners, they were experimenting on military personnel, and they were experimenting on civilians and even kids. I know some of you guys have probably seen that series Stranger Things. That's based off of real events. I mean, I'm not saying that show itself is real, but the things that you see in that show, as far as doing things to kids, like I said, experiments and things like that, those really happened. And so it's pretty crazy that our government was doing these types of things. And again, I mean, they've come out and admitted this, and they've apologized for it. President Clinton back in the 90s, he apologized on behalf of the U.S. government for, these types of things that were going on. So we may take a closer look at that later. But anyways, moving on. So the Suez Canal crisis. So in 1956, Israel launched an attack into Egyptian territory of the Suez Canal because Egypt had nationalized the canal and did not let foreign ships pass. So you can see here on this map, here's Egypt, here's the Suez Canal that goes into the Mediterranean Sea. Great Britain and France helped Israel and secured the Mediterranean Sea. The Soviet Union threatened to help Egypt if the United States intervened. So this was sort of it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it was, and I'll tell you why. Egypt was trying to seize control of this canal. It was internationally owned. Nobody really owned it prior. And but there's a lot of money that passes through this small waterway. This is where those big shipping containers are, that's where they travel. And so keep in mind, there's a lot of oil in this region. So by controlling that little waterway that goes into the Mediterranean Sea and then into the rest of the world, you're basically controlling the flow of oil coming out of the Middle East. And so that's why that was such a big deal. And so, again, just the zoomed in picture here. So the UN steps in and tries to intervene and resolve this situation peacefully. So President Eisenhower supported a UN resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire between the opposing sides and withdrawal of invading troops in that region. Reluctantly, Israel, Britain, and France withdrew their troops. This brought the Soviet Union closer to the Arab nations in the Middle East. So the Soviets and the communists are kind of, having a tighter relationship or a tighter bond with these Arab nations like Egypt in that region because the Soviets backed them up in this situation. The Eisenhower Doctrine, January 1957, Eisenhower offered military aid to any Middle Eastern nation seeking to resist communist aggression. So again, this is an attempt for the U.S. To contain communism because Eisenhower saying any countries in the Middle East that need help to resist the Soviet, communist influence, the United States will help you. So that's known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So again, it's just an extension of the Truman Doctrine. And it's an extension of that policy of containment that we mentioned a while ago, where the U.S. is doing everything and anything in its power to prevent the spread of communism to the rest of the world. There was an uprising in Eastern Europe. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the new president of the Soviet Union, Stalin had died. There's some conspiracy stuff there with Stalin's death, but regardless, in 1956, he had Soviet troops march into Hungary and impose a pro-Soviet government in response to an uprising. Eisenhower chooses not to send aid to Eastern Europe because he was afraid of a nuclear war, going against that idea of brinksmanship, which we mentioned a second ago. However, most Americans supported Eisenhower, and he got reelected. There was a brief thaw in the Cold War. Late in the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union moved to improve diplomatic relations. Vice President Nixon visits the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev even comes to the United States. So the president came here. The Soviet president came to the United States. So it seemed like things were getting better between us and the Soviets, which was good because maybe this Cold War is going to end. However, an American U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers gets shot down over the Soviet Union. And this U-2 spy plane incident causes the brief peace in the Cold War to come to an abrupt end because the Soviets see that the United States is trying to spy on them. So it kind of ended that friendly interaction between us and the Soviets, and the Cold War would continue. And this was like a huge event because, like I mentioned, people thought the Cold War was going to come to an end. And then once our plane gets shot down, now it creates a situation where they have a hostage and we got to try to negotiate to get them back. And again, it just it didn't do the relationship between the U.S. and Soviet Union any good. It's just the headlines here. So basically, Soviets shoot down our spy plane. Okay, so the Cold War at home. We will be taking a closer look at the Cold War on the domestic or home front in the next unit, but this does touch upon some things just real quick here. So it says that as you can see here, it says the origin of Captain America. So this comic book was quite popular in the 1950s. And I know you guys probably haven't really given too much thought to it, but, Captain America really, he's propaganda. And, you guys have probably seen most of the Avengers and Captain America movies and stuff like that. And, even in Winter Soldier, I believe it was, that movie actually had some like MK Ultra mind control type aspects to it that were based on real events. So when you saw the Winter Soldier at the beginning, he's being like brainwashed by, I think it was Hydra or whatever. Like that's supposed to be the communists, basically. So, but like it says here, the fear of communism led to a string of public inquiries, loyalty oaths, and trials of suspected communists and traitors. Also, there was a huge fear of nuclear weapons because they were just recently invented at this time. So, obviously, you all know who Captain America is, and you guys, I'm going to show you a few pictures here. These are top secret declassified photos, but you can see Captain America here in World War II. He was actually real, believe it or not. So, obviously I'm joking, but I thought those were kind of funny. Regardless, so Cold War fears. July 1947, Congress changed the War Department to the Department of Defense. So they just changed the name, basically. The National Security Council advises the president on strategic matters, and obviously those are still around today. The Department of Defense, it's our largest expenditure, meaning the government spends the most money on our defense budget, and National Security Council obviously advises the president still today because, he has a whole team of advisors that inform him of things that are going on around the world. And, obviously he can't do all that on his own. So they play a large role in that. So another Red Scare. Scares of communism reached home. There was a Red Scare in the 1920s. Red is associated with communism. So that's what this is all about. And so they kind of flared up again in the 1950s after World War II. The Loyalty Review Board was created to investigate all federal employees. Like it says here, they investigated over 20,000 federal or government employees. 2,000 resigned and 300 were fired as a result due to suspected communist ties. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, charged that Hollywood was full of communists by holding hearings to investigate people in the movie industry. The Hollywood 10 was a group of movie directors and writers who went to jail rather than answer questions on whether or not they were communists. And like it says here, hysteria spread quickly as a result of the HUAC investigation. So, you could only imagine if, today you could use the term terrorists, right? Back in the day during the Cold War, it was communists. But if I came in today and I said, hey guys, there are terrorists all over our country and we don't know who they are, but we're going to try to find them. I mean, that would create a lot of panic because obviously there are people that are out to do harm to us. And so that's kind of what this was all about. It wasn't terrorists back in the day, it was communists. But like I said, it was a similar type of effect. This is just a picture of the HUAC investigations, and this guy right here was in charge of these. That's actually future President Richard Nixon. So this is the Hollywood 10, which were the Hollywood directors who were accused of communist connections. And like it says here, the search for spies. So Alger Hiss was a New Deal lawyer who later joined the State Department and was found guilty of trading secrets to the Soviet Union. And then also Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a husband and wife who provided the Soviet Union with atomic energy secrets. And so, like I said a second ago, there was all this paranoia about communists within our own borders that were, trying to do harm to the United States. And then, but the thing about it is then they start actually catching some spies who were trying to, basically bring down the United States. And so that just kind of like fueled the fire for the paranoia of, communists within our own borders. And so, these two were both sentenced to death. They were executed. You can see here, Hess, headline here, is found guilty of perjury by jury. And so this is actually a spy, a Russian spy, a real Russian spy, who was caught a few years ago. So as you can see, this is the cover, I think, of Maxim or something like that, a magazine. And then they caught this lady and I think her husband. I can't remember the whole story. It's been a couple years now, but she was actually living in New Jersey. And it turns out she was an actual Russian spy. So, I mean, these things are still going on. We don't hear a lot about it, and you guys probably don't really give a lot of thought to it. But there's still spies around, and a lot of the, it's called espionage, but a lot of the spying between countries actually takes place online now. So it's a lot of cyber terrorism and those types of things, hacking. But there still are actual people in different countries. I mean, the U.S. has spies too. So, that still goes on. But like I said, it's kind of been more done on the digital front. So But like it says here, McCarthy's rise. Joseph McCarthy was a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin who helped spread the suspicions of communism here in the U.S. His claim to fame was in 1950 when he said that he had a list of known communists who worked at the State Department, basically for the U.S. government. And Margaret Chase Smith was a Republican senator from Maine who, she was the one who actually challenged McCarthy on his claims. And here's a quote from him. The communists within our borders have been more responsible for the success of communism abroad than Soviet Russia. And then this is propaganda here. Is this tomorrow? The American flag burning under, people being killed by communists, basically. And then, like I said, Margaret Chase Smith here says, I think that it's high time that we remembered that the U.S. Constitution, as amended, speaks not only of the freedom of speech, but also of trial by jury instead of trial by accusation. So she's basically saying, if you're going to make these accusations, you need to have proof. And there was actually a famous book turned into a movie called The Crucible, and it was about the Salem witch trials, which I know some of you have probably heard of the Salem witch trials, really famous incident that occurred in New England during the colonial days, but it was basically like that actual witch hunt. And so this book was written in the 1950s, but it was the basis of the book was actually, the McCarthy trials. So the things that were going on in regards to communism, it's kind of comparing communism to a witch hunt, basically. So McCarthy's downfall. In 1954, McCarthy's committee investigated charges that there were communists in the United States Army. Using the new technology of television, McCarthy used bullying tactics to interrogate witnesses. Many started to criticize McCarthy for his wild charges, and the 35 days of hearings failed to produce any evidence to support any of his claims. So essentially, he's kind of making these claims that he has a list of known communists, but he failed to produce any evidence. And so, it kind of just started to fizzle out because, if you're going to make those kind of claims, you need to have the evidence to support it. And he didn't. So the hydrogen bomb, a new arms race developed in the 1950s when the U.S. began work on the hydrogen bomb, also known as the H-bomb, and it was much more powerful than the previously developed atomic bomb that we dropped on Japan. So as you see here, it says nuclear fallout. As a result of the testing done on nuclear weapons, the Soviet H-bomb tests spewed tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere, and this led to far-reaching nuclear fallout. So obviously it's not good to be spewing nuclear materials into the atmosphere because eventually it's going to come down and, have negative health effects. Here's a quote from Eisenhower. You can't have this kind of war. There just aren't enough bulldozers to scrape the bodies off the streets. And he's referring to a nuclear war. So that was the big fear, at this point in time was, are we going to go to nuclear war? Because obviously we had developed the bomb towards the end of World War II, and then the Soviets got it in 1949. So, a lot of people had a lot of anxiety about this future war because keep in mind, right after World War II, we had the Korean War, and, tensions were high between the United States and the Soviet Union. So people were very afraid that, World War III was going to erupt. And obviously if that war did erupt, nuclear weapons or, weapons of mass destruction would be involved, and a lot of people are going to die, more so than even died in World War II. So religion and nuclear war evangelists such as Billy Graham attracted large audiences during the 1950s to warn about the dangers of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. Americans' religious devotion contrasted sharply with the official atheism of the Soviet Union. So again, the United States and the Soviet Union, we were like complete opposites. And so a nation that held religious belief, contradicted a nation that officially had atheism, which is no religion. The Pledge of Allegiance, like it says here, one nation under God, was added in 1954, indivisible with liberty. So basically that was put in there to sort of emphasize the contrast between the United States and Soviet Union. So it's kind of saying like, we do believe in a God and you don't. And that's just another huge divide between us and our enemies. That's the Reverend Billy Graham, who was preaching of basically the end of the world. He was kind of warning people of what the Bible said about the end times. And, a lot of people were afraid. So there's SpongeBob. He was the result of nuclear tests. Calming public fears. So the United States government launched a campaign to calm public fears. So again, people were very afraid, and so the government kind of started to try to educate people on what to do if we ever were attacked. And like it says here, there were a series of pamphlets, films, television shows, and magazines to try to tell people how to respond in the case of an attack. And they hoped that just kind of like informing people would help them to maybe feel a little better about it. So a lot of people started building bomb shelters, fallout shelters as they're called. So it's basically like an underground bunker. Some of them are pretty nice. The old high school, now the middle school, actually had a bunker. I believe now it's just a basement. So canned goods. Bert the Turtle was a cartoon character that was designed to be sort of like the spokesman for bomb drills. And as you can see here, he said duck and cover. That was like the motto. So here in schools, kids are doing basically bomb drills, nuclear attack drills, and they would duck and cover, duck under their desks, cover up. I don't know if that would be effective, but that was what they were taught. So the space race started when the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite into orbit in October 1957. This is actually a Soviet cosmonaut who fell from space. So the U.S. responds to that by, like it says here, President Eisenhower urged Congress to promote space technology by establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. Also, the National Defense Education Act appropriated millions of dollars to improve education in science, math, and foreign languages. So, it sort of the space race became a big focal point of U.S. education, and, the launch of Sputnik, this artificial satellite into space, again, scared a lot of people because now the Soviets could spy on us from space and perhaps even attach a bomb to that or some sort of weapon to that, and we would be susceptible to that, so that became a big fear. Space, the Final Frontier, and there is your study guide.